All right. So thanks for tolerating me for a third time. You're probably tougher than I am. So the talk that I put together here was something that I actually cobbled together last night. And effectively, it reflects some of my thinking regarding emerging threats, some of the discussions that Jordan and I have had. And I'm going to actually just beg your forgiveness here as I sort of just stumble through something that I haven't yet had a chance to practice too much. But anyways, I think there's some interesting things here. Okay, so what I want to do is start by essentially pointing out that we can learn lessons from the past. That there really is nothing new. And so I'm going to point to some data that I've discovered that I find very, very fascinating, very interesting in terms of informing ourselves as to the future regarding disturbance in forests as a consequence of a warming environment. I want to talk a little bit about uncertainty and how it's scale dependent, depending upon whether you're considering individuals versus populations. And then I'm going to present a bit of a framework where I think we can actually consider a way in which we can reduce uncertainty and think about threats that are emerging going forward. I'll give you a few examples and then wrap it up. So here are some data that I love. This is amazing. These are data that were derived from the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum, 55.8 million years ago. And what you see there are data that were collected based upon fossilized leaves that were dug up from, I guess, somewhere in Wyoming, I believe. Anyways, the point being is that these leaves were unearthed, and the researchers were capable of identifying the types of herbivory based upon the pattern of chewing or galling or whatever you have on these leaves, and then determine, as they dug down through the sediments, how the changes in this herbivory, the abundance and diversity of the herbivory, changed through time as the climate warmed and subsequently cooled through that time of the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum. So effectively, to take from this a couple of points. First of all, we can't expect a warming environment to benefit all insects, despite the fact that they're all ectotherms. This is not going to be the case. However, based upon these data, we can see that there was a significant increase in the amount of herbivory, in this case in birch-type forests, during a global warming interval that was similar in magnitude to what we got going on today. And it's based upon these data that I propose that we just assume that moving forward in time, we're going to see a greater deal of herbivory, a greater level of forest disturbances based upon insect herbivory moving forward in time with our own current rate of warming. So I mentioned I want to talk about the scale dependencies. And here we can talk about the potential effects of global warming on an individual forest insect. What is going to be the outcome? And there's a whole series of pros, and there's a whole series of cons. So from the point of view of the pros, what's an individual insect going to be facing? Well, reduced winter mortality, we see that all the time. Increased thermally benign habitat, places that are good for the insect. Reduced host resistance as a consequence of potential stress in the host. Escape from competitors and predators. Increased host range. In the case of the mountain pine, it's moving in towards jack pine. This whole list of pros, though, is mirrored by a similar list of cons. And so there might be phenological asynchrony. In other words, insects, being dependent upon temperature for their development, might be exposed to temperature regimes that actually put them out of synchrony with important things in their environment or with their host tree. Thermally benign habitat could be reduced because there are situations when things can get too warm for insects. There could be the shift or depletion of hosts. There could be competition or predation associated with other insects moving into the habitat that you currently occupy. And of course, there's always this, the cost of moving to new habitats. So this list of cons is equally as diverse and probably could be enlarged substantially when compared with the pros. So there's lots and lots of uncertainty. However, where we can start to find increasing amounts of certainty is when we start scaling up those things to populations of insects. And so effectively, the potential impact of a warming environment on populations of eruptive insects would be things like altered outbreak duration, altered rates of herbivory and damage, range expansion, or in some cases even contraction, and novel host species associations. So these are the kind of things that we can say with a great deal more certainty are likely the outcome of a warming environment from the point of view of consideration of biotic disturbances. Okay, so the question that we really want to ask is whether or not we can predict forest insect disturbance under climate change. That's really what we want to get at. Now, what's interesting here is that Barry Cook and I spent a lot of effort in a recent publication pointing out that it's impossible. Okay? In fact, we say that species-specific predictions are intractable simply because the compounding amounts of error associated with the altered dynamics in a warming environment make it almost impossible to predict exactly what's going to happen with an individual species. But that said, I'm going to propose that we can actually get at reducing uncertainty in a couple of ways. So I suggest we can reduce uncertainty around our expectation of future disturbances by first restricting our projections to the medium term, okay? The medium term, 40, 50, 60 years out. And the reason why I say that this is important is that in the medium term, well, I'll explain each of those, sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. I'll explain that a bit more in a moment. The second aspect here is that we consider disturbance agents as functional groups based upon their basic population dynamics and based upon whether or not they occupy the entire range of the host. So let me take each of those 2 points in turn. Let's talk about this issue of the medium term. So essentially, I'm proposing that in the medium term, uncertainty of disturbance actually diminishes quite substantially. Yeah, okay. And the reason why I say that is the case is that when we consider the current forest distribution, trees are relatively captive to the sites in which they're growing. And effectively, trees that are on a site can persist there long after the conditions that were necessary for their establishment have changed. So trees are captive and are expected to be captive on these sites for some decades to come. Secondly, through time, we can expect, as we know climate change is going to deliver to us, changing conditions. And thirdly, those changing conditions can bring on stress in these captive trees. And this means that these trees themselves are going to be more likely to be disturbed by biotic disturbance agents that are highly responsive to stress in their host trees. Okay. In the long term, of course, because we expect really large changes associated with ecosystem dynamics, our uncertainty is expected to increase dramatically with regards to disturbance. So that's the first thing. The second thing has to do with the framework itself and the assertion here that basically the spatio-temporal ubiquity, in other words, are your insects in an environment or not an environment, is going to constrain the suite of landscape-level consequences associated with a changing climate. It's a mouthful, but let me just demonstrate what I mean by this in terms of what I consider to be 4 major functional groups that we might have to consider going forward from the point of view of future disturbances. The first would be what I'd call the native ubiquitous disturbance agents. And in this particular case, the biotic disturbance agent occupies the entire range of its host. You can consider things like the eastern spruce bugworm and balsam fir. You can consider things like spruce beetle and spruce. By contrast, we have native invasive species. And of course, we're all here talking about the most prominent one there, where in fact you've got an insect that only occupies a portion of its potential range. You have native innocuous, and this is a tough one. But this is the case where you've got something that, up until this point, has been largely innocuous and unknown from the point of view of disturbance. In that particular case, it's been benign. And finally, another well-known one is whether or not species are considered alien and potentially invasive. So if we consider those in turn and ask what could happen over the landscape based upon insects occupying those particular groupings, if you're native and ubiquitous, then the expectation of climate change from the point of view of how you function as a population on the landscape is going to be something around changing outbreak frequency and duration and changing rates of herbivory or damage. That's the constrained suite of outcomes with that particular group of disturbance agents. If you're native invasive potentially, of course, that has with it associated changes in outbreak frequency and duration as well as damage rates, but also the big one, and the one that we can detect most frequently, is this issue of range expansion or contraction. If you're native and innocuous, well, this is something whereby a particular disturbance agent is coming out of nowhere, and ultimately you're seeing it over the landscape simply as a consequence of changing damage rates. And finally, if you're an alien invasive, of course, we have changing damage rates as a consequence of introduction to a new environment, and of course, expansion from that point of introduction into other habitats. Okay, so what I want to do from this point forward is provide you examples of insects that fit into these groups. And I'm not trying to preclude the initial statement that I said that we can't make species-specific predictions, because I'm not attempting to do that. Instead, I'm going to show you examples of insects that fit into each of these groups. So let's begin with the native ubiquitous. In this particular case, we've got the spruce beetle. I mentioned that already. Essentially, the spruce beetle is everywhere its hosts are. And this means that the potential impacts of climate change can manifest as something like changing outbreak frequency, changing duration, or changing rates of herbivory. We've seen lots of activity with spruce beetle in the past, so we've had large outbreaks in recent decades. We've certainly got anecdotal evidence as well as tree ring evidence for outbreaks in previous centuries. Changes in host availability are likely unimportant in terms of spruce beetle. And we certainly don't think, at least in part where most of the impacts have occurred lately, that forest management impacts have been important in terms of affecting these outbreaks. Well, we have had, in recent decades, some pretty significant spruce beetle outbreaks, and it's going again in northern British Columbia. But of course, in Alaska and Yukon, back between 1994 and 2005, roughly 2 million hectares were impacted. Unusually high levels of mortality. In fact, I was in stands where basically 100% of the stems were dead, which I thought was phenomenal. And this brings about the question as to whether or not this is a climate change impact and an example of increased herbivory rates. Well, in fact, there are climate signals in this big outbreak. The first comes with altered volatilism, or life cycle duration. So the spruce beetle is really interesting in the sense that over most of its range, it takes 2 years to complete its life cycle. And it has the requirement that it overwinters as a fully mature adult before it can actually become reproductively mature and start another generation. And this means that in an environment with increasing thermal inputs, it will still remain in a 2-year cycle until as long as it doesn't get to that fully mature adult in a single year, meaning it resists the potential for a shift in volatilism. However, there comes a point when warming is sufficient that the beetle develops all the way to a mature adult in that first summer, in which case it immediately flips to a 1-year life cycle. So we have univolting populations that lead to an increased risk of outbreaks and greater tree mortality. That's well known. But on top of all that, over most of the area that was affected in this northern outbreak, we had the situation where we had warming. And that warming was not accompanied by an increase in precipitation. And as a consequence of the lengthened growing season without the addition of water, we had stress in trees. And so as a consequence, on top of that, we have an increased herbivory rate as a consequence of increasing susceptibility in their trees. So let's look at a native innocuous example. And here I'm going to use the pinyon Ips beetle, Ips confusus, as an example. A really interesting system because it was historically benign and not known to do much in the way of damage. Potential climate change impacts based upon the framework I've suggested would be a change in herbivory rate if there is a climate change signal in its outbreak. And indeed, in and around 2001, 2, and 3, we saw an enormous uptick in the populations, and we had roughly about 1.4 million hectares spread over the southwest of the US. Outbreaks during previous centuries, unknown, hence its innocuous label. Influence of host availability, unknown. And it's unlikely that forest management has had any influence in the system at all. Lots of pine mortality, especially in 2000 and 2001 and 2. Roughly 1.4 million hectares, as I said, innocuous. And we asked the question as to whether or not, based upon the framework I suggested, this is an increased herbivory rate. And the answer to that can be sought out in terms of increasing host stress. And actually, basically, during the period in which we were concerned here, based upon the US Drought Monitor, in this area here, there was an exceptional drought through the years of that outbreak. And in fact, what we found was that there was, based upon the drought that you can see here, a real significant outbreak by the beetle, which is a consequence of an exceptional drought and an increase in host susceptibility as a consequence of increasing stress. and ultimately we have an increasing herbivory rate. So ultimately here we have yet again a climate change impact that fits with our proposed framework. All right, the native invasive, no need to go into detail on this one. We're talking about the mountain pine beetle here. It doesn't actually mirror its potential host range, not yet at least, and potential climate change impacts as a consequence would be a change in outbreak characteristics and range expansion. And of course, we know range expansion has been happening, but we can't rule out the fact that there's also been all kinds of other influences in this system. We have essentially knowledge of previous outbreaks, and indeed there's evidence based upon fossilized insects of mountain pine beetle activity in the Rockies going back 8,000 years. So it's a natural part of the western of North America. Is there an influence of host availability? Well, absolutely. And what I'm showing here is the outbreak in its early stages, but also in blue, what I've got here is a line indicating the increase in the amount of susceptible pine. And that's largely been a consequence of forest management activities. Fire suppression primarily, but also selective harvesting in certain parts of the southern part of the province. Is there a climate change effect? Well, yeah, definitely. This represents the distribution of mountain pine beetle up to 1970, and only 1970. And what I want you to notice, the points here represent mountain pine beetle. The area in this flesh tone indicates the distribution of lodgepole pine. That mountain pine beetle only ever occupied a portion of its potential range, and it was restricted by two things. Cool summers, indicated in blue here, and the occurrence of -40 for at least one day in the wintertime. So these things work well together. But of course, that, as a constraint relaxed, we've had a situation where the beetle has moved into new habitats at an increasing rate, and as a consequence has expanded. Despite the fact that we've had an increased amount of susceptible pine, we have a climate change signal based upon movement into formerly unsuitable habitats. All right, the last one I want to touch on just very briefly is this issue of alien invasives. And this is a tougher one because the state of the research is not quite caught up to the type of research that we're doing here in this room with regards to understanding climate change impacts. So in this particular case, I'm just going to propose an example of that being the emerald ash borer, which we all know about, first detected in North America in 2002. Whether or not climate change is having an influence on this one, we don't know, but we can certainly speculate. Changes in herbivory rate are definitely a consequence of the fact that this insect is now encountering evolutionary naive hosts. It is expanding its range tremendously, in part by human transport. But here I think we can say with a fair degree of certainty that potential climate change impacts are going to be associated with increasing the amount of thermally suitable habitats as a consequence of additional warming. Okay, so with that, let me conclude. So insects are a major form of disturbance and are highly sensitive to climatic variations. We know this, that's axiomatic. In the medium term, which we can define here, say roughly 50 years or so, the uncertainty of disturbance will decrease due to increasing climate change-induced stress on captive forests and population eruptions by biotic agents in response to host stress. Now the flip side of that particular statement is this. Cyclic species, bloodworms, or species that are unaffected by host stress are not likely to respond in the same way as those that respond very quickly to stress, and so are probably less likely to be of concern. In the longer term, disturbance uncertainty is going to increase dramatically, and this is simply because ecosystem dynamics are going to be altered by warming environments. The spatio-temporal ubiquity of a biotic disturbance agent will determine the suite of potential landscape-level consequences of climate change. Effectively, if we know where it is and what it does, we have some clue as to what might happen going forward in terms of the ultimate impacts that we might be seeing on the environment. And effectively, this statement is all about the need for enhanced vigilance. We need to keep a look on our forests and be certain that if we're starting to see an insect that could be a problem occurring in an environment where it hadn't been previously, we might be on the brink of a range expansion. If instead we start to see an insect causing damage to our trees that we hadn't seen previously, we might be looking at something that was formerly innocuous that is now becoming a problem. Or if we start to see an increase in impacts by an insect that has caused problems in the past, but it's doing so at a frequency or a rate that we haven't seen previously, we might be looking at something that fits into the native ubiquitous category. And finally, native ubiquitous and native innocuous pests have altered outbreak characteristics. And yet native invasives and exotics are the ones that we primarily consider to be the range expanders. And I think that's it. Yes, thanks.